Good morning, Iklanate, and thank you for joining us here today with the ICA team as we process the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on the ongoing climate emergency and crisis. Today, the team at ICA, including Rebecca Sinclair, who is our new Director of Programming and Education, Jacob Crane, who is our Just Transition Lead, and JC Chiblo, who is our toolkit coordinator and our education and training manager. Today, we are going to be looking and processing what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report really means for us. So I want to thank you all. My name is Ariel Tsekwi Duranje. I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, which is located in Treaty 8 territory. I'm the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. And climate change and climate justice is something that I hold near and dear to my heart as my community sits within the zone for the expansion of the largest industrial project on planet Earth, the Alberta tar sands, which has really destroyed my people's lands and territories over the last 60 years. But what's made it worse is that this very project has contributed to rising greenhouse gas emissions. So it hasn't just disrupted the lands and territories where my people live, including the contamination of our water systems, our food sources, and the destruction of critical habitat and migratory patterns of species. This project is contributing to global climate change, which is affecting our water systems, which is affecting our weather patterns, and further entrenching the crisis for our people. My story is a story that is felt across the globe by many Indigenous peoples that experience climate change, first and foremost and most adverse. So I want to thank my team for joining us. This recent report from the IPCC has really highlighted the major risks and dangers that are coming about from the climate crisis. This includes that over 3 billion people, and much of the species of the world are vulnerable to the climate crisis. In addition to that, our trade routes for our food sources, whether that's by boat or by plane, are further becoming more risky to travel because of new changes in our weather patterns. These extreme weather patterns are affecting our ability to transport goods and services, which is going to have direct impacts on fuel, on food, and the security that our people need. There is going to be huge impacts on fresh water sources. There's going to be impacts on the quality of life for many. What's most contrasting and scary about this recent report is that climate change is advancing at a much faster rate than anticipated. And it's the world's poorest and vulnerable that are at the greatest risk from actual death from the climate crisis. For years, in places where we see extreme extraction, we talk about how these projects have contributed to the cultural and actual genocide of our peoples. And now we have climate change that is coming forward and really furthering that endangerment of our lands and territories. And as our people are moving towards reclaiming our indigeneity and our sovereignty and our self-determination and our reconnections to the lands and territories, those lands and territories are being threatened by global climate change. And what's worse to this story is that we are the least to contribute to the growing crisis. We are the least to contribute to rising greenhouse gas emissions. Yet we are feeling it first and foremost, and our abilities to reconnect with our lands and territories are further at risk, deepening what is now recently being called climate anxiety. I do want to start by saying that one of our speakers today, one of the team members is not feeling well, and she's only going to join us for a few minutes. So I'm going to pass it over to JC, who has a really important story of her experiences at the COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, just this past year when we all went to attend the Conference of the Parties as a part of the United Nations Forum Convention on Climate Change, where world leaders and thousands of Indigenous peoples came to discuss global climate policies and initiatives to combat this growing crisis. But within that context, Indigenous peoples are often still invisibilized, marginalized, and shoved to the side. And JC, I'd really like you to share your story about what it was like for you to interact with some of the folks from the IPCC.
Gwach, thank you, Ariel. I'm first going to introduce myself, of course. So Minande Beneshi Kwe Indigenous Gitikanzi Bean Donchva, Gigo and Doda, Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao, Port Moody, Megwand and Da. So hello, my name is JC Chillo, as Ariel mentioned. I'm from Garden River First Nation in the Great Lakes Anishinaabe territory, but I currently reside in unceded Coast Salish territories just outside of Vancouver in a town called Port Moody. Yes, so thank you for that wonderful introduction. I did want to share this story despite the issues that I'm dealing with today, but because it's important, I think, especially to preface this conversation that my team is going to have here. So yeah, we went to COP last year together. It was my first time, and I was lucky enough to be invited to listen in on the Indigenous Knowledge Holders Gathering, which was the first to happen at the Conference of the Parties at this platform ever, and we hope that it gets to continue. So these knowledge holders were brought from all over the world using the 7 different regions that the UN recognizes. So there were some folks from so-called Canada that were there, and they had youth representatives as well. As I was listening in on their first day, they had a guest speaker come in from the IPCC. I believe they're called committee. I'm not really sure. I'm sure Rebecca or Ariel can correct that later. But this person came and was on a panel and was talking about this knowledge. And when I say this knowledge, I'm talking about the knowledge that goes into this report. He kind of gave us a lowdown of the kind of knowledge that they use, which is heavily science-based, heavily government report-based, and basically just completely excluding Indigenous knowledges. And of course, this was at the Indigenous Knowledge Holders Gathering. So this was in front of people that have the knowledge of our people, the knowledge of our land. And this person said, what did he say? The reason why Indigenous knowledge is not being included in this report right now is because there is no way for us to assure. So basically what he was saying is because we don't have methods for quality assurance of our knowledge to make sure that it is at the same level as theirs using their standards, that is why it wasn't included in the report. And in the moment, I was like flustered and frustrated. It was probably the most frustrating thing I heard, like the most arrogant, just like incorrect thing I had heard that whole conference. And I couldn't help it. My face reacted, and I'm pretty sure he saw, and I might not have been the only person, because again, this was to Indigenous knowledge holders that he was saying this to. And then of course he backtracked and was like, oh, but we can one day if you all just put in the work to quality assure your knowledge. And in that moment, of course, I was like, oh goodness, that just like reduces us down to one. And there's so many different Indigenous peoples across the world, not just in so-called Canada, right? Because this was the international group that he was speaking to, making sure that we all have the same when it felt so unrealistic, and putting the work on us when they should be the ones that are looking for our knowledge. And I will say it was a positive experience for us to have the Indigenous knowledge holders gathering there. And I was just lucky to be able to sit in. I am definitely not one of those selected folks. So hopefully moving forward, we can find ways to maybe push back on that kind of terminology when it comes to our knowledge, and find ways that work for us as Indigenous peoples to tell them this is how you include our knowledge in a way that feels right to us as Indigenous peoples. But I am going to dip out now. I wish you all the funnest time listening to my fellow coworkers. I know I will definitely be listening in later. So thank you so much. I am going to head out now, though.
Thank you so much, JC, for sharing that really important and critical story. So as we begin to unpack this new report, we need to keep in mind that this report is driven, as JC said, by Western science, Western data, colonial government reports, and it has historically and continues to exclude Indigenous knowledge sets in providing the framework of what the growing crisis looks like. And that's an important conversation as we move forward. But before we dip into what is this report, why is it important, I really want to pay respect to the fact that we are in a very strange time in the world. We are dealing with not just this climate emergency, climate crisis, growing climate change, but we are still moving through a global pandemic. We are still moving through the fact that there is political and socio upset across the globe, with wars waging in many parts of the world, not just Ukraine and Russia right now, which is the first and foremost on our mind, but in Yemen, in Palestine, in many parts of the world, we are seeing political upset. And so there are people already on the fringes of just barely being able to survive, where their energy systems, their healthcare, their water, their security is already stretched to the limit, and people are already experiencing deprivation and oppression. And we have this growing climate crisis to also pull into this mix of everything that's happening. And our own communities here in so-called Canada are still dealing with the appropriation and land theft of our lands and territories, the places that we call home. And as climate change increases, eco-anxiety increases. And I would really just like us to start this conversation, Rebecca and Jacob, like, how do we combat climate anxiety as Indigenous peoples?
I think I'll jump into that one first, Jacob. So Tanseo Sale, Musqueam, Squayo, Nistigalason, Chinida, Barrenlands First Nation, Little Saskatchewan First Nation. So I'm originally from Barrenlands First Nation, which is in northern Manitoba, and I grew up in a small abandoned mining community called Lynn Lake. And I really appreciate, Ariel, your commentary on where you're from and the lands that you're from. I think that it really goes to show like why we do the work that we do and how it's an inherent part of who we are to be here in these spaces, to show up in these spaces, that it's not just work, that it is like literally life or death for most of our families. Lynn Lake has been on a boil water advisory for many years, since I was a child. The amount of people that come out of Lynn Lake with health issues, and it is predominantly Indigenous that are in Lynn Lake. And I want to like preface this with, so Brochet, the school only goes up to grade 8. Lynn Lake goes up, has high school. So most people from neighboring reserves will go to Lynn Lake for school. And that is how we have a predominantly Indigenous community within Lynn Lake. Many of the townsfolk, since the mine had shut down, are experiencing all sorts of health related issues. So there's water insecurity, there's food insecurity, there's health issues. And when I go to the work that I do, I really like think about how I was raised, and I was raised on that land, and how that informs the work that I want to push forward. And a lot of these issues that I seen in growing up in Lynn Lake, growing up in Brochet, I see them like written out in this really weird scientific report, and so far removed from that humanistic aspect. The one thing that I want to say about this report, though, is that they've started to tie in this humanistic piece of that. So they're starting to talk about like the actual human focus of what climate change is really about. And when I start to think about all of these like issues that are going on within our communities, all of these issues that are happening to my friends and my family, it can get me down. And it can get me down because I see these reports that are coming out that don't have their stories embedded in there, that don't have an understanding for my kugum, that do not have an understanding for my mother. And it can get to you, right? Like it can really be the thing that can either make you or break you. So part of what I do to really combat that eco-anxiety is talk to elders and knowledge keepers. One specifically is my uncle, Victor Tazazi, who I call quite often. I think I'm a little bit of an annoying person to him sometimes, because I'll just like message him on like every social media platform there is until he responds to me. But part of the teachings that we get within ceremony, part of the teachings that we get with when we sweat, when we smudge, is about that cleansing, about that moving forward, and about that inherent duty that we have to this land. It's not to say that we're giving up or moving forward, it's way more nuanced than that. And it's about how we strive as individuals and how we are centering ourselves within our families, within our ceremonial lodges, within our teachings, so that we can move forward in a good way and realize the constraints that we have as individual people and the constraints that we have as our Indigenous communities, but also understand the power that we have within ourselves. And that's a hope that I pass down to my children when we're talking about these huge pieces like the IPCC report, and it feels like a mountain to climb, but I assure you it is a mountain that we can climb. I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you, Rebecca. Jacob, would you like to share how you, as yourself, how is it that we can combat, again, climate anxiety as Indigenous peoples in the face of all this information and the state of the world?
Siaskas, Ariel. Daranestara, Sise Jacob Crane at Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Crane and I am from Tsuut'ina Nation, located in Treaty 7 territory in so-called Southern Alberta. And some of the things that I do, and I share this with my friends all the time, and I just say, look to our culture, look to our culture and our traditional ways of life, because that's what's been passed on to us through the generations from our elders and through our ancestors and their fight. And that's how we honor and that's how we combat that climate anxiety. And I feel like there's like three things: either we're cleansing to go into ceremony, we're blessing ourselves to have a good day, or we're in protection mode. And right now I feel like I'm in a protection mode. So my usage of sage and tobacco and dance has really increased over the last couple of years. Especially after seeing the IPCC report, I feel like I've been smudging daily, trying to bless myself, but and cleanse myself and protect myself. I put a little bit of sage in my shoes, and that kind of helps me. That does a psychological, protection and prayer for me, and that's how I kind of do it. I also found myself over the break. Anytime I really have break and I'm on the land, I go to ceremony. I go to sweat. And it's nothing new. It's just something that I have to do more frequently of. And so something that Clayton Thomas, or no, not Clayton Thomas. Sorry, Clay, you're a great guy. It was Isaac Murdoch. He was the one who was like, if you want to combat climate change, just do more native things, do more Indigenous things. And from a guy who said that we never used to have trash, like, go back to that way of life. I think that's the best way to kind of combat that climate anxiety that we may be all feeling. So anyways, hope that helped a little bit. Oh, and dance more. I've been dancing every single day, and my body and my back feel it, but it's that connection that's helping me get through these hard times.
Sounds like a lot of humility from both of you, a lot of connection and relationships with other people. And ultimately it's around being Indigenous and really leaning into that. And also the fact that there's joy. You talked about dance, and Rebecca, you're oh, it's really hard, and you laughed. And it's one of those things that I notice about Indigenous people and BIPOC people almost wholly. We laugh in the face of adversity, literally. And that's really important. But let's talk about this report for a minute, because a lot of people don't even know what the IPCC is. They don't know what this report is. It's and as JC said, they don't even include our knowledge in it. So why should we give a crap about this report? What is it? So just to give a little bit of context, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created as a body to look at climate change. I can't remember when they were started. I could find that information. Maybe Rebecca, you can Google it while I'm talking and you can figure that out. I believe it was in the 80s, could be in the early 90s. And this is a science body, a Western science body made up of hundreds of the world's top Western climate scientists. I want to make sure that we keep that in mind, because as JC shared with us, they don't include the fact that our people are some of the best biologists, some of the best climatologists, some of the best, every kind of science that you can think of. We have been doing this for thousands of years. Our knowledge sets have helped guide Western science and take it to new levels over and over and over again. 1988, that's when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created. That's an important context because at that time, there was no UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples were still fighting for basic rights. Women had just been granted personhood because in 1987, Indigenous women finally could be independent and not lose their status if they married a non-Indigenous person. There's a lot of stuff we were still just beginning to have basic human rights, even in countries like so-called Canada. And that's even worse in other places where human and Indigenous rights were being abrogated. So this body, they'd sort of assess climate change every few years, and they release reports that are based off of all of this Western science and data. And they then come together and they compile this one report, and then they sort of release it that looks at the impacts of climate change, adaptations, vulnerability. It doesn't really say like, this is what we need to do generally. And in the past, it hasn't had a human face to it. It's just been like, here's the numbers, greenhouse gases are increasing, weather patterns are getting more erratic, and, these things are being impacted, but no real human aspect. But there's been a growing shift and trend, even in Western science, to begin to apply that human lens. And as we do that, we're also seeing that interruption of Indigenous peoples being like, what about the human relationship with the land? What about our knowledge sets that's just driven from that relationship? How is it guiding it? And so there's been this disruption, but we're not quite there yet. So this recent report, though, shows there's that we're in deep crap right now. The planet is not healthy, and we're seeing more heat waves, more erratic rainfalls and extreme flooding. We're seeing extreme weather just all over the place, tornadoes in times when there's not tornadoes, tsunamis, all of this stuff. We're seeing this crazy increase of extreme weather patterns. And it's critical that we take real action right now. That's what this report is saying. The clock is ticking. A lot of these environmental groups are saying, we got to do something. We can't just wait for things. So in Canada, we have a plan that in 2030, we're going to start to decrease our emissions. That's like 8 years from now. We're still trying to we're working towards like baselining at 2030, which is crazy because this report is saying we don't have that time. We don't have that time. There are over 3 billion people on this planet that are at risk. Most of them are Indigenous, land-based, poor folks. Most of these people are going to be affected the most. And we cannot have incremental change. We need rapid and aggressive change right now. So this report, that's what this is. That's what this report says. It's important for us to understand the Western science because it helps us know where our knowledge set as Indigenous peoples fits in. So I want to ask you, like in relation to the work that you both do. So Rebecca, you work on decolonizing climate policy. Jacob, you work in just transition and divestment, Indigenous-led divestment movements. Why is this report important, not just to your work, but to our communities?
Want me to go first again? I'm always like awkward silence for like at least 30 seconds. I'm just gonna jump in with a joke or say something always. So anyway, so decolonizing climate policy is a critique on climate policy plans in so-called Canada to date. We've released that report. You can find it on our website. And we are in the thick of it for phase 2, which is really identifying what Indigenous-led solutions really look like. So this IPCC report, I always think about it in the context of Western science and how it's like solidifying these ideas and the proof in the words that Indigenous people have already been saying for a long time. So it is validifying that for non-Indigenous folks is how I think of it anyway. And I think that it's really important to see that because for a really long time, I'm going to back up. We have never had the time to for adaptation, for mitigation. We have not had this time. We've been saying this since 1988, IPCC came together, right? I think like that is an important context to have, because in the 90s, you know, going through school, I remember people talking about climate change and how a lot of people didn't believe that was a thing. And we said back then, we don't have the time. And now we're seeing like massive fires all over so-called Canada. We see extreme temperatures. We see all of these changes happening before our eyes. We don't have the time even now to hum and haw over whether this is happening, whether this is an actual thing. So when we look at, and I also should say, but this emergency, this crisis, this push to say we need to do something right now has often left our people behind, because they can't validate our Indigenous knowledge in the same context that they can validate their Western knowledge. And I think that that's a very important distinction, because we see policy plans, we see climate plans, we see adaptation measures through IPCC, through UNFCCC, through the COP, through all of these crazy acronyms that who even cares about them, honestly. We see these plans push forward without our people, always. And even now, when we have rising gas prices, there is no thought process to how flying communities are accessing food security. There's no thought process to how there's water shortages. We've seen this amplified through the COVID crisis as well, that we don't have the same access to healthcare. We don't have the same access to sanitary methods. And that is a huge problem that we see within these IPCC reports, is that those impacts to our communities, those real life things that are happening with our friends and our family, are not being recognized within these reports. And that's something that we're trying to do with decolonizing climate policy, is really bring a face and a forefront to Indigenous-led solutions within our own communities, and how we're doing that and amplifying that within our own communities. And I've had some really great conversations with a whole bunch of different types of people from all over so-called Canada. And really, what does that look like? And it looks like just being Indigenous. Like, how do I combat eco-anxiety? I go to the land. How do I combat the climate crisis? I go to the land. And that is like at the heart of what Indigenous-led solutions are, is within our teachings, within our language, within our education, our healthcare. All of it is so interconnected. And I was listening to somebody who had a little bit of a bleaker outlook on the climate crisis. Was like, do you see solutions happening? And they said, no, there's no solutions really happening. And I was like, oh my goodness, what do you mean? I've like talked to like 50 people that said that their solution. And really at the heart of what they were saying was, what we need is a mind shift, a shift away from the current context and what we're looking at as solutions, and shift our mind to the Indigenous worldview, to how we have a relationship with the land, to how everything that we do is embedded with how we show up to that land. And I think that was a very important teaching that I had received during this whole process, that we need to call out solutions that aren't real solutions, that leave our people behind, that leave marginalized communities behind. They can't be solutions without those voices. So I wanted to like stress that work that we're doing too, and calling out false solutions. Like raising gas prices is taxing the polluters. Yeah, that's a simple thought, right? We're going to tax the polluters. But what does that mean? And how is that pulled through to our communities with food insecurity, with health insecurity, with infrastructure insecurity, all of these deficits that we're experiencing as Indigenous folks? When we think of solutions, like electric vehicles, how is that being rolled out in the North? Who is paying for that? How are they getting to charging stations? How is that mitigated in the weather patterns? These are a lot of questions I think everybody should be asking when solutions are being rolled out. when solutions are being put forth as sign on to this right now because it's the climate crisis. Yes, it's a crisis. So we all need to be banding together to ensure that solutions aren't being held while people are being left behind.
I think like those are such important notes. Like this report highlights the urgency of the crisis. It highlights the impacts that it can have. It's taking a more humanistic role, but it's still not incorporating some of those real lived experiences to drive forward solutions. Now, Jacob, you work in like the field of just transition and Indigenous led divestments. And like sort of, and like Rebecca, you're working kind of like on the policy side. One of the things that I found about this report is that despite the fact that it's trying to include and integrate more economic and social science into and social justice in the adaptation to climate change, like the narrative, it's there and it's beautiful that it's there, but it's still it's just like on the edge. It's just on that precipice, right? But it still degrades the climate crisis to a mathematical equation. Just like how much greenhouse gases do we need to reduce? How do we penalize the oil and gas companies without thinking about the human consequences that it has? And so just transition and the work of Indigenous just transition focuses on that relationship with the land. It focuses on that. So when you see this report, Jacob, and it says, we got to do something right now, and you have people being like, no one's doing anything. What do you have to say to that? Like, how do you respond to this report as like, yeah, we got to take more aggressive action? How does it relate to Indigenous just transition movements?
I'm smiling over here because I think like Indigenous people, we're helping ourselves. Like we're getting out of this and we're carrying our elders with us, our young people. We're trying to create these systems and mechanisms that are building a better future while trying to leapfrog and get ahead with this new idea of like renewable energy. And it doesn't even need to be renewable energy. It could just be like going back to gardening and living off the land, which is being Indigenous, hunting and gathering, picking berries, but making sure we're not over picking berries. And that's the thing that we're kind of falling into a little bit, I feel like, with like a lot of the things that are happening in today's society is the consumerism, that take everything. Don't just take the bush, take all the bushes. And it's like that's not our way. Like that's not who we are. And so going back to being Indigenous and harvesting when certain seasons are there, and teaching that to our young people of the just transition, and looking at it from an Indigenous lens and perspective of what does a just transition look like, and how do we get back to that? So that's food sovereignty. That's looking at working with the land, where there's the community, the culture and language, and then there's the land, and putting all those together. And Ariel, I got that from you, so thank you for sharing that message with me. Just so you know, that's not me, that's 100% Ariel there. But it's working with those concepts and putting them together on what is the best project for that area? What is that best project for that community? So like on the Navajo Nation there, they have a lot of sunshine, but there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of trees or grass or whatever. So there's a desert. So, maybe listening to that natural compass and learning, like listening to Father Sky, that's the best project to build there. Or in the north, where there's a lot of rivers, maybe a run of the river project, listening to Mother Earth and maybe that's the best project. Like we don't always have to bulldoze and just clear it all. Like that's not Indigenous just transition. That's Western colonial style. We have to start listening to these natural laws and working with the land and the community, the language, and the culture, where we're upholding that sacred right of being stewards of the land. And so listening to those natural compasses or laws, they're the ones that are going to be really guiding us in this Indigenous just transition space. And reviewing the IPCC, I did a brief overview, but going back to the whole conversation of like, it excluding Indigenous people, that's something that I've been mentioning in these conversations that I've been having with a lot of settlers. Is they bring me into these panels to speak, and I'm speaking to them, and I'm like, you guys have been driving the car for 150 years. You crashed the car. You have to let Indigenous people have a try, because we already know your outcome. And since we all want to build an inclusive so-called Canada for the next 150 years, then we need to let other people drive the car, and you get in the back, and we're not driving your car. That car is wrecked. We're driving our own car, and we're going to go this way, not that way. We're going this way, and everybody's jumping in, and we're going to let the other marginalized communities drive too. But we already know that you can't drive because you just, so there's a lot of systematic changes that need to happen. That's kind of what I'm saying. And until that happens, I feel like people with the climate justice and climate action, it's all lip service. A lot of these politicians, these colonial structures, like, yeah, it's good that like it's a useful tool, but it's not really hitting home on what we're addressing, and that's the systematic change. There has to be a systematic change so that people can start to understand and hear our voices, and to see through our Indigenous lens that that way is not working. We've already been down that way of, oh, let's put that tax on it. That's a false solution. It doesn't work. That's going the exact same way that you've been going. So there has to be a lot of changes happening, and working with the land, respecting our culture and our traditional ways of life, being Indigenous, being inclusive, creating those inclusive. Yeah, they may have been exclusive to us for the last 150, or really since first contact, but we have to be the ones to be like, okay, come here, it's okay, you guys crashed, get over here, we'll help you, and that's practicing being good relatives to them as well. So there's a lot of healing that needs to happen, I guess. And I hope that kind of answered your question there, Ariel.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think like some of the things that I maybe want to ask you guys and get a little like into this like report, right? Because like it's depressing. Anyone who's read this report, it's just like, oh, millions of people are going to die. All these species are going to die. Everything is horrible. We got to do something right now. And a lot of the solutions are like really like, oh, we got to like increase taxes on the oil and gas sector. We got to decrease oil and gas, like high emitting industries. Yes, absolutely. We have to do those things. But we also have to think about the social justice components of this work, right? We have to think about that we can't just think about this as like a calculation on a grid of how we reduce emissions and how we stabilize the economy, because a lot of this is like, oh, we're talking about GDP losses, we're talking about economic disparity, we're talking about trade routes, all of these things, which we all live by. But Indigenous communities have these connections where, for example, my community 30 years ago was 80% subsistence, 80% subsistence off of the land. That's wild to think about, that in the like 80s and into the early 90s, my community was still subsistence based. And they had to be by circumstances because we were a remote flying community. It was not economically viable to get all of your food from the grocery store. And that gets to your like relationship with the land piece. So we have this report. It's all like, oh, there's no solution. Like we are doomed. People are calling in this like code red for the planet. 95% of the Earth's land area could become degraded by 2050. Oh, it's so doom and gloom, and it's scary, right? It's really scary. But I want to share a quick story, and then I want to ask you how we address this scariness, this doom and gloom that we have to do as much as we can from a science base. We got to just reduce those emissions. That's that our main point is. On the West Coast, there were salmon runs where the salmon were basically extinct. And there was very few left. And they were just like, this is going to affect the entire ecosystem of the coastlands, the species, the bears, the trees. Everything relies on salmon to survive. There's like, running out of salmon isn't just about like, oh, no one gets to eat salmon there anymore. That's not what it's about. It's about the trees actually absorb the nutrients from when the bears take the salmon out of the river and eat the carcasses, and the carcasses degrade, and then they add nutrients into the soil that the trees utilize. It's an entire ecosystem. So everyone was freaking out. Oh, there's no salmon. Everyone's like, this is it. Industry, this is everyone's fault. We've lost it. And the Indigenous peoples worked. I heard that there were ceremonies to talk to the salmon, to call them back. There was a lot of like integration of like being like, how do we save the salmon? By being in relationship with them. That salmon run, I can't remember which one it is, but those salmon came back 2 years later in numbers that had never been seen for decades. and that we don't know. Like all the Western science and data out there cannot determine our fate, and that things can change by changing our relationships with the land. Things can change by that. And that when we see these reports, it can be really scary. And I'm not saying we don't take it to heart. I'm not saying we don't take aggressive action now. But how do we as Indigenous peoples not get scared that we're going to lose all that land that we're fighting so hard to try to get back? You know, land back movements, reconnection with the lands and territories. When you see this report, it's like everything's screwed. All the animals are going to die. All the land's going to disappear. How do you respond to our people that, yes, this is scary, but what are those things that we say to our people to inspire them to move forward? I mean, 80% of the world's biodiversity is where? In the hands of our communities. There's a reason for that. I would love to hear your articulation as to like how our knowledge, how our ways of being can address this like depressing eco-anxiety that's coming from this report.
I'm gonna go first this time. I hope that's okay, Rebecca. But I feel like we've been in climate change situations and scenarios before as Indigenous people. We've come out of those, and so we've come out of those like better prepared. And because of like, you know, settler colonialism, they're trying to get us to get away from that. Like they want to get us away from them. They want to erase that way of life so that we adopt their way of life, which I kind of described. It's not going in the right direction, and it kind of led us to this climate crisis that we're in right now. And so I think it's just looking back at our traditional ways of life, and we're fighting so hard to protect those ways. We're literally stopping pipelines. We're stopping we're calling for TRC across so-called Canada. Like we're making these movements here, and I think that's what kind of gives me hope, and that's what should be giving our people hope to get them through these next, you know, the next few generations. And to, you know, sometimes it's good to wake up. I'm thankful for the I Don't Know More movements. I'm thankful for the No DAPL movements and all the other movements after that, because it kind of sprinkles the seeds of resistance, that resiliency. It like wakes us up. It does something to us. It's that state of mind in our being that wakes up, and it makes us stronger. It almost feeds. It's almost like it gives us more energy, and it's contagious. It gives our people more energy. And so that's kind of like our way of combating that and preserving and protecting it. And because we are in connection and stewards of that 80% of the biodiversity within the world, I'm not really too worried. And it's not the 1950s anymore where you can just go in there and just get aside, move aside, Indigenous people. You're you're not humans. Like it's 2022, and we have no problem standing in front of a bulldozer anymore. And there's more of us coming every single day because of these movements, and it's contagious. And I think we just have to keep up the good fight. We have to ground ourselves in that Indigenous knowledge so that we're ready to go out the next day. And every time I show up to work at ICA, I'm always willing to learn. That's the humility. I'm always willing to practice, and I'm always willing to work with the community and my community here with my sisters that are ready to go. And I'm learning a lot as a man. I'm learning a lot here, and I always have to be aware of being in these spaces. And I love it. I love what I do, and I love that, you know, we're here to be a part of that, to be a part of that change.
Connie, Jacob, my brother. I was thinking about a couple of things in how we tackle this big issue. And like for me personally, I feel like this is rooted in social justice. So climate justice is social justice. What is social justice though? And it's really looking at that inequity that's happened within our peoples. So I always do this like really weird roundabout way of talking about things, and I'm like trying to connect all the dots, and like sometimes like people get lost, but like I want to say that that's by design. Like there is so much interconnections and intersections of how we live as Indigenous folks. And I think like really the heart of this is equity, and the equity in our decision making, the equity in how we're tackling this as citizens of this world, of this global world. And these things aren't going to happen. They are happening. And I want to stress that, because whenever I hear people talk about the IPCC report or any scientific data that's coming out about climate crisis or anything along those lines, it's always like, this is going to get worse. This is going to happen. It's bad right now. It is terrible right now. And I want to stress that. And it's if we don't do this, this is going to happen. We need to start thinking of like, that is going to happen. So we need to make some changes now. And we need to like mitigate for that. I think about in our communities when invasive species come in, and a lot of Western scientists are thinking about ways to like make sure it stops spreading and it's not going to go anywhere further. And our Indigenous folks are like, oh no, they've made a home. We need to start thinking about how we accept them into this ecosystem and how we mitigate for that. And I think about that quite often, and how we're tackling climate change and how we're trying to like bring this all down to Indigenous knowledge systems. There is so much capital in our knowledge systems. There is so much to offer within our knowledge systems that people are starting to write this in reports, starting to put this at the forefront of climate policy plans. Indigenous knowledge is going to help. But without us driving that conversation, people are always going to fall short. It makes me think of the gardening programs that went up north to my community, and how unsustainable those gardening programs were, because you had to like fly in soil, you had to fly in all of this stuff, and that's not sustainable for community members. And a lot of the times, those types of things that have happened in our community are transport systems. They're like, oh, this worked over here, so we're just going to implement it over here. But the problem with all of this stuff is that we're not there driving this change. We're not there from the very start making these plans. And I think that if we want to assert traditional knowledge, like I certainly will, that there are solutions within traditional knowledge, then we need to be, like Jacob said, at that driver's seat. We need to be driving our own vehicle, saying our own thing. And I know, Ariel, you have like this great analogy about these islands. And I just love that. And I bring that up all the time. And it also brings up this, like a few concepts here is the romanticization, is that a word? Romanticizing Indigenous folks as these peaceful land guardians that are keeping the land. Like, nah, man, we're fired up. And it's part of our prophecies. It's part of our teachings. It's part of our land acknowledgements within our ceremonial spaces. It is part of what we've been taught. And when we say that we need to bring youth along, we need to make sure youth have access to those teachings. It's really embedded in that our prophecies really state that the reclamation of our land is coming. So we're not going anywhere. We haven't went anywhere. There was literal genocide of our people, and we're not going nowhere. And we don't plan to go anywhere. And we see that starting to, like I see land acknowledgements across so-called Canada. Well, that's still, needs some work. I think like people are recognizing in which territory they are standing on. They're seeing that our Indigenous territory goes beyond these reserves. And I think like that in itself is hope. When my daughter goes, Mom, would you want too much of something or too little of something? And I was sitting there thinking about that for a really long time. And I looked at her and I said, having too much of something has never taught us anything good. And she goes, yeah, you're so right. Learning with too little, is it too little? And I was like, exactly. And like just her like reflection on that piece really gives me hope for like what the future looks like, and how we can embed that hope within our children without putting that the harm responsibility on their shoulders, right? We are in, I think it's the third generation with my children from residential schools. I always say this too, like you can't look to the future and think about all of these good things without really recognizing the legacy and trauma of colonialism. We can't look for solutions without understanding that completely and wholly, because that is at the root of what I'm talking about when I say equity. Is there equity in our education? Is there equity in our healthcare? Are we allowing people like my daughter to have all the tools that they need to combat the problems that are coming in the future? They're coming for the 7 generations ahead of her and the 7 generations behind her. And I think like that is really at the crux of what we're talking about, right? Like, so it's more nuanced than just giving you 1 or 2 solutions. It's nuanced in the way we feel about the land. It's the way we parent our children, and it's the way we recognize the legacy of harm and how we're looking to the future within our prophecies and our teachings.
Thank you. And I know we're going to wrap up this conversation right away, but you've outlined some really critical, important ways in which we must combat this crisis, this emergency, this thing that we're in. And I love the stories from our children. You made me think of something else that my son said just recently. He was just like, the present doesn't really exist. He's like, the past is infinite and so is the future. And I was just like, that's true. He's like, because the present immediately becomes the past. And so he's like, so we have to think of like the world as the past and the future. And like, those are the 2 realities in which we live in. And when we think about climate change and all these solutions that we talked about that are sort of being ignored within the greater construct of the climate crisis, and in this report, they talk about something called hard adaptation measures and soft adaptation measures. So hard is like biophysical, institutional, financial, social, and cultural, and soft is technological and socioeconomic. And I like this framing because what it's saying is that technology and like socioeconomic things are soft. They can change, they're malleable. But what isn't super malleable and easy to adjust is like the ecosystems, is the institutions that are like staunch in their spaces. It's the financial sector that has its claws deep in us right now. And our culture is a hard part of like the ways in which the limits to adaptation. So they gave a great example. Small island states can only adapt so much because they cannot control the rising sea levels. Our communities can only adapt so much because we don't have control over those institutional financial sectors. And what's even worse to this is that the solutions that we've talked about, and this is outlined in this report, is that there is no finance coming towards this. Most climate financing is directed towards mitigation, and in like the private and public sector, and it's going to like big projects that are already held by large corporations, like the Elon Musk's like electric vehicles and all of these things that might not be tangible to small island states or rural northern Arctic communities. And that developing countries or communities living in impoverished or marginalized states are 5 to 10 times the cost to them for adaptation is 10 to 5 times greater than other parts of the world. Yet that finance gap is continuing to grow as warming grows. So there is no financing for the adaptation measures that we talked about, and that we need to see a divestment movement that doesn't just look at what are our highest turnovers and lowest risks to investment, but the investment of the world. How do we change what GDP means? How do we change what value sets to my headset died.
How do we change that value set to invest in these solutions that we've talked about as Indigenous peoples? How do we move the targets from just focusing on corporations to reduce their emissions? But how do we invest in those solutions that come from the land, that come from the communities? And we don't just go, oh, you guys are really good at adaptation. Like, you're so industrious. You're so good with so little. And while it's true, we can learn a lot from so little, we also can't be expected to work in a deficit. We have to be empowered. We have to be invested in. We have to be believed in that this is part of the solution. The ecosystems and the biodiversity on this planet are just as important in addressing the climate crisis as it is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if we don't value those ecosystems and the people that steward, protect, and have deep relationships with them and invest in those solutions, we're going to continue to widen that gap of social inequities, of financial inequities, of access to power inequities. We are going to continue to see the marginalized become more marginalized, the poor become poorer. And we have to change that. As Jacob said early on, this is about fundamental systems change. It's about a fundamental shift. And Indigenous peoples are challenging what it means to work in divestment, because divestment movements have talked about, we need to stop investing in oil and gas, but it's like, then what are we invested in? How do we change the frameworks of what financial success looks like, not just for our communities, but for the planet at large? Because this is the crux of the problem. Our communities have experienced climate change since first contact. The first contact is when we saw the changes to all of the systems that are listed in here, our socioeconomic systems, our agricultural systems, our waterways, our food sources, energy, everything was disrupted when contact came. And we have been striving to return back to those basic value sets and asking for those investments in our communities. Now is the time. So at Indigenous Climate Action, we're really trying to disrupt this narrative. And we have really great ways for folks to get involved in participating, not just in responding to these reports, but ways to get involved. And so I would love to ask Rebecca and Jacob to share like ways that folks can get involved at ICA, what kind of programs we have so that folks can get more informed about things like the IPCC report, where our rights intersect, how our knowledge is so important, and how we can address some of these fundamental barriers that are being created through colonialism, through extractivism, through capitalism, and ultimately through ongoing systems of white supremacy. And I would love to hear about the amazing programs, if you guys can talk about them. I know JC left, so I'm not sure who wants to talk to the climate leadership, but we have some really amazing ways for folks to get involved that really hones in on being at home in your home fires and your own communities.
I could talk a little bit about the work that we're doing with phase 2. Part of like, I'm just going to name it, like, we need funds. We need funds for Indigenous folks to come together and amplify and uplift the words that they want to do, the works that they want to do within their own communities, and how we put that at the forefront. You talked a lot about that finance inequity, Ariel, and I think like that goes to the heart of what we're saying here too. So not just to ICA, but to the communities that are working at those deficits. How do we amplify what they need? And I see this happen in many different ways where people want to support financially, but want a lot of reporting, want a lot of labor, want a lot of intensive work right back. And I think that like goes away from like the actual spirit of what we're trying to do when we invest in Indigenous communities, is we allow them to take hold of what they're doing, and the finance part is the least of the problem. And I think like that's important. And I have like no shame in saying, I think like too, we look at phase 2 and how we had reached out to people. But what we're really asking is this emotional labor, this, not specifically just us, but other organizations. A lot of the time that isn't contributed into like what we're giving. And I think like that's important. So when we look at reciprocity for knowledge, in Anishinaabe and Nehawan cultures, that's offering tobacco. That's a recognition of a gift. And that's really for saying, I honor your time, I honor the spirit that you've come into this conversation with, and I honor the energy in which you come into this conversation with. So that was something that we had looked at when we were doing phase 2, and how we're honoring people in our own ways, in our own rights. The climate leadership work that JC is doing is really looking at how we uplift and amplify those things within our communities. Like, to me, climate leadership is a climate solution. It's about getting people more knowledgeable about this the climate crisis in a way that's relevant to our communities. And I think that's the important part. I always say, does my Kugam understand this? And it's because we're doing something on her land and on her territory, and we want to do or extract or anything. Is she understanding the information that you're giving her? Is it relevant to the community in which she lives in? And I use this example quite often because it's part of the work that we're doing in phase 2 is, does my Kugam understand? And really that's at the nuance of residential school. That's at the nuance of day school. My grandma has limited education in the Western system, but has cared for and has taught me everything that I know. So if people come up to me and go, oh, Rebecca, you're really smart. And I'm like, yeah, my grandma taught me everything. And I think like giving and honoring that respect is very important. So I wanted to highlight that, is that our people know what they're doing within the lands that they are on. They just need the support and the encouragement and information that's relevant to their communities. I went on a little bit of a tangent, as I sometimes do, but those are some of the ways that we're looking at helping, where we have the youth leadership program. And I think part of that work is like amplifying and uplifting Indigenous youth that are working in this. Like as part of phase 2 as well, is how are we bringing youth along for this ride? Personally, I always bring my kids along for the ride. And part of that is like this generational learning and really holding space for that generational learning. And that's why our youth need to be involved. So that, you know, when we say, what's the experience you have, or what's the experience that you bring to the table? And I say, well, I grew up with my grandma on the land. I grew up with my mom on the land. I grew up on the land. That is my experience. That is my learning. That is my generational learning. And so I hope that I do the same thing for my children and push that forward. And that's all about how we tackle this decolonizing climate policy. It looks less westernized, and I often get these questions of like, what are the solutions? What are the Indigenous-led solutions? And I don't have one or two answers for you. Like I have nuanced answers for you. It's investing in the programs in which we're doing with climate leadership, decolonizing climate policy. It's getting the voices of those marginalized folks, of people like my Kugam, of my mom and my daughter. So there's just a few of the ways. So we're also calling out these false solutions. I think like that's really important work that we're putting at the forefront as well, is saying no to solutions that leave our people behind. And then getting people at those tables, not to, but I always have a sticky feeling about that, because I'm always like, I don't want to be at your table, but I recognize that this is the reality in which we live in. So I'm going to show up and disrupt as much as I can. So I think like that's another important way that ICA is doing that work. As I think of some more, Jacob, do you want to go on yours?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Rebecca. I love hearing your knowledge there, and knowledge of your Kukum. I feel like I've learned more. I've learned a lot from your Kukum, even though I haven't even met your Kukum before. But yeah, ways to support our work. Sign up for our email list. Get a hold of us. I know we have a Just Transition guide coming out in June. Fingers crossed, maybe July. But sign up for our workshops. We want to help teach you. We want to help coach you, mentor you a little bit on getting involved in the Just Transition work that we're doing, especially the divestment stuff. Support our campaigns, or not our campaigns, our movements. Support our movements. Like and share our stuff on social medias. I always say it's good to see Indigenous people supporting Indigenous people. So we love supporting you guys. If you guys can support us a little bit, that'd be awesome. Not just financially, but also showing up in these spaces and ready to learn. That would be amazing. It's been one heck of a ride this past year. I've been a part of ICA for 1 year, and it's been one hell of a ride, and it's been very awakening. So if you're ready to learn and help be awake with what's going on, join us. Come on in.
Yeah, so we've got some really great programs. The Decolonizing Climate Policy Research that Rebecca just spoke to, there's going to be phase 2, phase 3. We're looking at gatherings. We're looking, as the pandemic opens up, having more in-person events, The climate leadership training is online. I believe we're still accepting applications on the climate leadership page on our website. So check out all of our programs at www.indigenousclimateaction.com. Check out our social medias for other opportunities. But I think one of the other things that I do want to talk about is we want to hear your stories. So if you have stories and you're just like, you know, we have solutions in our communities, we want to hear them. We want to profile them on our social media. If your community is doing something extraordinary and you want us to amplify it and do an Instagram takeover, like we're there. We're there for this because we want to support the sovereignty, the self-determination. We want to share your stories. We want to show the world and showcase how incredible our knowledge is, how powerful our knowledge and rights are in addressing this emergency and providing solutions and pathways, not just to taking care of the land, but being a part of everything from grid reform to adjustments to food security and sovereignty, to energy systems, to all of it. Like we're a part of all of it. Our communities are doing all of it. We're doing all of it, and we can't be excluded to just one narrative. And the solutions are vast and diverse. And lastly, within that context, we want to nurture the fact that as Jacob talked about, this is about healing. We have a lot of deep wounds to heal. And we need to support that we're still in the face of violence, colonial violence on the front lines. And so we want to support healing. So we have like healing grants for young activists on the land. With a youth leadership program is going to be offering trainings this year on things like understanding nonviolent direct action, on understanding what it means to work within climate justice movements. We're going to be offering all sorts of different trainings, both online and offline throughout 2022 and into 2023, and look for new ways to engage events, webinars, so on and so forth. But all of this is in part a part of the solutions that they're asking for within this. When we fight a pipeline, that is reducing the emissions. When we build a renewable project in a language camp like Ottoman Collective, and we support that, that's supporting biodiversity, safeguarding and management. When we support interrupting those systems and the decolonizing policy work and highlighting false solutions like nature-based solutions, that's us disrupting the status quo that has gotten us into this mess, that has driven that car and crashed it. That is the work that we're doing. And we are actively a part of this movement to decrease emissions, to protect and safeguard critical biodiversity, and find ways to address the social inequities that have existed because of systems of colonization, extractivism, colonialism, and ultimately systems of white supremacy. So we welcome you into our journey to divest from status quo and invest in creative, tried, tested, and true processes that Indigenous peoples have been utilizing for thousands of years. And we do have hope. This report might be grim, but we have hope. I don't know if there's any closing words from both of you, but I want to say Masi Cho for joining us on this journey on unpacking what this report really means, and that there is actionable things that we can all do to address this crisis. So thank you, and Masi Cho, closing words from both of you.
Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you later.
Agasane, Ariel and Jacob for having this lively discussion. I think I'm always just surprised people want to hear me speak. So I'm just saying thank you for like taking the time in the past, however long this was, to hear our conversation on this and really just work at amplifying the work that ICA is doing with what Indigenous communities are doing. So Agasane.
Bye, everybody. Take care.